Hi, my name is Jonathan White. I'm an associate professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University, and I am the author of two books with LSU Press. My first book with LSU is called Abraham Lincoln and Treason in the Civil War, The Trials of John Merryman. I published this book in 2011, and it's the story of a man named John Merryman from Baltimore County, Maryland. And at the very beginning of the Civil War, he burned railroad bridges around Baltimore so that Union soldiers couldn't make it to Washington, D.C. And he was arrested for treason at the very beginning of the war, thrown in prison at Fort McHenry, and held there for 6 weeks while the Union decided what to do with him. This book, again, was released in 2011 in paperback and hardcover, and it tells his story of what happened to him to get arrested and then when he was ultimately released. I'm here today, though, to talk about a book I published in 2014 called Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Reelection of Abraham Lincoln. And this one was just released in paperback, actually this month. This is a book I actually began writing when I was in college. I was an undergrad at Penn State. I studied under my mentor, Mark Neely, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Penn State. And when I was a senior at college, I wanted to do an independent study. And so I went to meet with Mark, and I said, I'd really like to do an independent study with you next semester. Could we do that? And he said, sure. He said, what would you like to write about? And I told him that I wanted to write about desertion among Pennsylvania regiments during the Civil War. And he said, well, it's not really a very good topic. Come back in a week and we'll talk about what you might be able to do. And so I came back a week later and I met with him in his office, and he had a list of 3 topics that he knew I could write about from central Pennsylvania, the middle of nowhere. And one of them had to do with Unionists in eastern Tennessee, because Penn State had some microfilm records that I could use. I don't remember what the second topic was, but the third topic that he gave me that I could write about was the soldier vote of 1864. Soldiers voting during the Civil War was a very new thing in terms of absentee voting. Prior to the Civil War, Pennsylvania and New Jersey permitted soldiers to vote during the War of 1812, but then shortly after the War of 1812, New Jersey repealed its law, so that by the time the Civil War came around, there was only one state with a law in the books that allowed soldiers to vote, and that was Pennsylvania. And the only book that had been published on this subject had been published in 1915 by a Union veteran. And so Mark Neely knew that this was a good topic that was ripe for scholarly inquiry. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was planning to write about it himself in his book called The Union Divided. He ultimately gave the subject to me. And I was so grateful to him for his mentorship and for giving me this topic that I thanked him and dedicated this book to him when it came out in 2014. And I did my senior thesis or an independent study at Penn State on the soldiers voting in Pennsylvania during the election of 1864. And then I did my master's thesis at the University of Maryland on the soldier vote, looking at Maryland, New York, and Pennsylvania. And then I published the book with LSU Press, and it looks at soldiers from across the North. As I mentioned a moment ago, prior to the Civil War, or at the beginning of the war, Pennsylvania was the only state that allowed soldiers to vote. And in the fall of 1861, soldiers from Pennsylvania voted in state and local elections in October of 1861. And there was a lot of fraud in those elections, and there were a number of contested elections that took place. And as a result of that, the law was challenged in the courts. And in 1862, the state Supreme Court of Pennsylvania struck the law down as unconstitutional. Now, at the very beginning of the war, the thought of absentee voting for soldiers was not a partisan issue. There were some Republicans who supported it. There were some who opposed it. There were some Democrats who supported it. There were some who opposed it. And they didn't really take a partisan stance on the issue. But then the fall elections of 1862 took place. And in those elections, the Democrats made huge gains at the state level, at the national level. They picked up 30-some seats in Congress. They won a number of important governorships, including New York. They carried some state legislatures. And Republicans looked at this and they thought, I think the reason the Democrats won in this election is because the Republicans have all gone off to the army to fight, and the Democrats have stayed at home still eligible to vote. And so from that point forward, the debate over whether or not soldiers should be allowed to vote when they are away from home became a very partisan issue. And Republicans almost uniformly support extending the ballot to soldiers in the field, and Democrats almost uniformly oppose extending the right to vote to soldiers in the field. And by the time of the election of 1864, 19 northern states have passed laws that enable soldiers to vote. 4 of those states, Connecticut, Minnesota, New York, and West Virginia, have their soldiers vote by mail, essentially, their proxy votes. So those soldiers would cast their ballots in the field, sort of. They would put them in an envelope with paperwork and then mail it home. And then someone would take the ballot out of an envelope and then officially cast it with the home vote. And then the other 15 states allowed soldiers to vote in the field, and they set up polling places when Election Day rolled around. And so the last book to be published on this subject was published in 1915 by a man named Josiah Benton. He had been a Vermont soldier during the war, and his interest in this topic was partly academic, I suppose. He wanted to research and better understand what happened, but also sentimental. 1864 was the first election he was old enough to vote in. And so as an old man in the early 20th century, he was thinking back to his time as a young man when he had fought for the Union and cast his first ballot for Abraham Lincoln. Now, 78% of the soldier vote in 1864 went for Lincoln. And historically, scholars have looked at that number and interpreted it to mean that soldiers had become overwhelmingly supportive of both Lincoln and emancipation. And so one of the things that I do in this book is I challenge that idea, and I suggest that just because 78% of the soldiers who voted for Lincoln doesn't mean that they had become Republicans in large numbers or that they had necessarily come to support emancipation. And I offer some interpretations of that 78% statistic. What does it mean? And some of the things I do in this book are I look at intimidation. What was it like if you were a Democrat in the Army in 1864? To a large extent, you felt silenced. You felt like you were part of a cancel culture, I suppose, where you didn't think you could speak your mind and not be punished for it. And so I found a number of Democrats who would write in private letters and say they're afraid to speak freely about politics. They're afraid they might be punished by a commanding officer, or if they're an officer, they're afraid they might lose their commission and be dismissed from the service for opposing Lincoln. I also, in this, look at soldiers whose views wavered over time, where they might be supportive of Lincoln at one point when the war was going well, and then at another point, summer of 1864, when the war is going badly, they're less enthusiastic about Lincoln. And I found several soldiers who write very explicitly about this. And they ebb and flow in their opinions of the war, whether or not they will vote for Lincoln. Some of them ultimately do, others don't. Ultimately, I think a number of Union soldiers voted for Lincoln because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Democratic Party in 1864. The Democrats nominated General George B. McClellan, who had been a commander to many of the soldiers early in the war. They loved George McClellan, and McClellan was a pro-war Democrat. He was pro-slavery, but he was also willing to fight the war. But McClellan was put on a ticket with a man named George H. Pendleton. And Pendleton was a Peace Democrat, or Copperhead, from Ohio. And not only that, they were put on a platform that called the war a failure. And I think there were a lot of soldiers who looked at this ticket and they thought, I could stomach voting for McClellan, but what happens if he dies? What happens if he dies in office? Then you get a Copperhead, a Peace Democrat, who's going to be running the country and running the war effort, who's going to end the war effort. And they thought, we can't vote for that, or we can't vote for a platform that calls the war a failure. And so I suggest in the book that a significant number of soldiers probably chose not to vote in 1864 because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Lincoln and the Republicans because they saw Lincoln as standing for emancipation and abolitionism, and black equal rights, but they also couldn't bring themselves to vote for a party that seemed treasonous to them, that called their efforts in the battlefield a failure. And so I argue in the book that, you know, the 78% statistic pertains to the men who vote, but it doesn't include the men who chose not to vote. And it was never easier to vote in America in the 19th century than in the election of 1864, just in terms of logistics. If you lived in a rural part of the country in the 19th century and you wanted to vote, you might have to walk miles to the polling place. But in 1864, when soldiers voted in the battlefield, they just had to walk up their company street to the captain's tent. And so it was very easy to be able to vote. And so if you were part of the electorate among the soldiers who chose not to vote, I think many of them were making a conscious decision not to vote. It never would have been easier for them to do so. And so these are some of the things I talk about in the book. I also have a lot in here on, I did work in a lot on desertion, which was the original topic I'd wanted to write about when I was a senior in college about 20 years ago. And I look at soldiers who deserted because they weren't willing to fight under the Emancipation Proclamation. I look again at intimidation and coercion, the punishment of soldiers who articulated anti-emancipation views. And these were all things that have been touched on by a number of scholars, but I think I was able to give them a new overall interpretation in this book. I've been fascinated by 19th century politics ever since I was in college, and I really gained that fascination by studying with Mark Neely and Bill Blair at Penn State. And it's interesting to think about the issues that came up in 1864, because a lot of them are still really important for us today in terms of voting by mail. That's a really big issue, and it became a big issue for the first time during the Civil War, when 2 million men are away from home during election season. And one of the things that fascinates me about the Civil War is the material culture of the war. And so what I want to do with the balance of the time here is show you some images from the election of 1864. Whenever I start a new book project or an article or something, I always do an extensive search for images related to that topic. And I find that images can be a helpful way to think about it and to view a historical subject. You get to see a moment in history through the eyes of an artist who lived at that time and who witnessed it. And so I have a number of newspaper prints, and I'm going to just pick a couple of my favorite ones to show you, and hopefully this will work. Some of the things you'll see in these prints will give you a sense of how politics is similar, and some will give you a sense of how politics has changed. This is a Democratic campaign rally for George McClellan in New York City in 1864. You can see the signs and the banners in the same way that when there's a rally, a political rally today, people carry signs. You can see them here as well, the slogans that they're carrying for McClellan. You can see women are at this rally. Even though they could not vote, they were political participants in other ways and attending rallies like that one in New York. Of course, we're not having major rallies this year because of COVID, and that's why we're doing a digital thing like this with Facebook Live. But they did have massive rallies at night then as well. And this is a print that shows Union Square in New York City on September 9th, 1864, at the statue of George Washington, and a massive crowd of Democrats who've come out to campaign for for McClellan. And I can't see it here, but I think it's right around here. There's a speaker on the stand. And there were a number of speaker stands at rallies like this. Sometimes they would set up multiple stands. There was no amplification. And so you'd have to have different speakers in different parts of the crowd who would be talking to the voters, getting them excited to go out and vote. Here you have a Democrat on horseback with a torch out there getting people excited to vote for McClellan. And here is a parade, again at night, of people who are excited to go out and support General McClellan. The images of the polling during the Civil War can be very interesting in the way that they capture different areas. So this was a print from London Illustrated News, and you get a sense of the class dynamics here. On the upper portion of this page, they have what they call the upper 10. These are the wealthy elites of Manhattan. And I'll pull it in here a little bit. There we go. The wealthy elites at their polling place. On the bottom half, they have what they call the lower 20. And this is the 5 Points neighborhood, which is, of course, very famous. And you can see the violence. There's people punching each other, the dogs in the streets, the drunkenness, the disorderly nature of the election. And for readers in London who were fascinated to know what's going on in America during this election, how are the voters voting, they get this depiction that captures how did the elites participate in an election in a very dignified way, in a very deliberative way. How do the poor participate? And if you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, you can sort of picture 5 Points neighborhood. That's the neighborhood that's being depicted on the bottom half of the print there. Let's see, I'll skip that one. When elections took place, they were held in different ways than they are today. So today, if you go to vote, the government has had the ballot printed up, and there's different places on it for the different parties. So you might, check off you're going to vote for the Republican candidates or the Democratic candidates or the Green Party or the Constitution Party. You pick who you vote for, and all of their names and party affiliations are on the ballot. It didn't work that way in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the politicians actually made the ballots themselves, and they would then go to the polling place, and when you went to vote, you would find the party operative from your party, and you would take a ballot from him, and then you would go and you would walk up onto a platform so you were above the crowd, and then you would cast your ballot into the ballot box. And the ballot boxes were usually glass bowls with some sort of frame around them. So you can get a sense there is no secrecy in how you vote in the 19th century. We don't get what's called the Australian ballot and the secret ballot until later in the century. And so when voters voted, they would go to their party operative, they would get a ballot. Often they would be distinctive colors. They might be yellow or light pink or blue. And so as you're carrying your ballot through the crowd, everyone can see how you're going to vote. And that gives your neighbors a tremendous amount of power in terms of being able to influence you. If your boss is at the polling place, you might not want to vote against his wishes. And so you might feel coerced to vote a certain way. And so the scenes that come out of the election often capture this, some of the fraud and chicanery that took place. Here in this one is a man who has gone to a number of polling places and voted many times, and he's been caught for voting early and often, and the police are there to take him away. Here's another image from 5 Points, and in this one, the men are voting in what appears to be some sort of grog shop. You have all sorts of barrels, and that is where they're voting. They're not voting in government buildings the way we do today. They vote in public places. And the last one I'll show of the civilian voting is this spread, which is from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And this is one of my favorite images from the entire war. On the one side, on my right, you have a drunken man who's being taken to the polls by 2 Democratic operatives. And the caption says he's being taken there by the Philistines. And on the other side, you have a Union soldier who's been wounded and a War of 1812 veteran who are walking together arm in arm to vote for Abraham Lincoln. And this gives you a sense of the partisan nature of the press and the depictions in the newspapers, where the Democrats in this election are perceived as being drunkards and getting people to vote for not good reasons, whereas the Republicans, they are the veterans of the War of 1812, of the Civil War. They are casting their votes patriotically. Now, I'll just close in a minute or so, and then if there's any questions, feel free to type them in the comment box there. The soldier vote had some fraud connected to it. There were state agents from New York who were sent down to Baltimore and to Washington to collect ballots and then send them back en masse to New York, where they would be cast at home. And the people in Baltimore were arrested for making crates full of ballots, and they were basically stuffing McClellan votes in and putting fraudulent names of soldiers, just made up names of soldiers on the envelopes and sending them back. They were arrested and tried before a military tribunal, and the prosecuting attorney, the judge advocate in that case, said that they should get the death sentence. They ended up instead getting life imprisonment, and then about 2 years later, I think, they were released from prison. So they didn't get the death sentence for what they did. 3 more men were arrested in Washington, D.C., and were tried in a military tribunal. They were acquitted of their crimes, but the Lincoln administration was still absolutely convinced that they were guilty. And this is a cartoon that showed up in Harper's Weekly in November of 1864. And it's called How the Copperheads Obtained Their Votes. And you can see what they're doing is they're writing down the name of a deceased soldier from his tombstone so that they can fraudulently put his name on a ballot and send it back so that he can vote for McClellan and vote for the platform that calls the war a failure. And the implication is, well, of course, he would have voted for Lincoln if he had still been alive. There are a number of images that survive of what voting looked like in the field. I will just show you a few of them. Here's one that purports to show General Sheridan casting his vote in the field. I don't think it looks like him, but that's Sheridan there. This is actually the one I scanned in and used for the front cover of the book, showing soldiers together in a deliberative experience, talking about how they're going to vote in the presidential election. And then this one here, I've always really liked. It's called The Approaching Election in the Camps, Group of Soldiers Reading Political Handbills. And you can see it there. And in this image, the men are standing around, and I will say the accounts of the election in the field itself are generally showing that it was peacefully held. But I've always been intrigued by this image showing that they're reading political handbills, because Democratic literature, and this is one of the things I talk about a lot in this book, Democratic campaign literature was kept out of the camps. And Democrats complained that they couldn't get Democratic newspapers, or they couldn't get Democratic ballots or campaign documents. And so only Republican campaign literature was made available to the soldiers. Republican campaigners were absolutely fine with that, as you would imagine, and Democratic soldiers and campaigners were very frustrated with it. For those of you who are interested in these sort of images, how you find them, I actually found all of these on eBay, and I bought them about 10 or 15 years ago in the process as I was writing this book. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. I'll wait for a moment here and look in the comments box. And otherwise, if I don't see any, thank you for tuning in. And I hope this has been interesting and informative. And if you're interested, again, you can get Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Reelection of Abraham Lincoln out in paperback now from LSU Press. Thank you so much.